Cleaning Up is brought to you by the Liebreich Foundation and the Gilardini Foundation. Hello, my name is Michael Liebreich and this is Cleaning Up. My guest today is Claire O'Neill. She's the Managing Director of Climate and Energy at the WBCSD, that's the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. Between 2017 and 2019, she was Minister of State for Climate and Energy under Theresa May's government. And in that role, she pioneered the UK's Clean Growth Plan. She launched the Powering Past Coal initiative. She laid the groundwork for the UK to become the first major economy to target net zero emissions in 2050. And she led the charge to secure COP26 for Glasgow, which will, of course, take place later this year. By a complete coincidence, Claire and I were also at Harvard Business School together, and in fact, we were even in the same study group. Please welcome to Cleaning Up, Claire O'Neill. So, Claire, welcome to Cleaning Up.
Thanks, Michael. I think you've got a slightly nicer background than me, but very good to connect with you.
Well, I'm stuck out here in Switzerland, in Les Diablerets, and a lot of people, when they see this background, they go, "Where are you? Are you in a sauna?"
Well, are you? This is a good question. You could be later. That's the point.
Okay, so technically I'm not in the sauna, I'm in my office, although there is a sauna just over there. So now what I'm going to do, because this is Cleaning Up and we have a thing that we're allowed to drink if it's the right time of the evening and the kids are put to bed, etc., then I'm allowed to have a little drink. I hope you've got something there.
Yes, cup of tea in hand. Yeah. Somebody made me laugh by saying they were having a net zero January. I thought that was quite a good way of describing it.
Yes, I'm not having a net zero January. It's not the worst January for hitting the bottle, but it's certainly not net zero. There's too many good white wines around here. Now we are actually, Les Diablerets is actually just up in the mountains above the seat of WBCSD, your new gig, isn't that right?
Yes, and well done for pronouncing it properly. I did suggest to Peter Backer that maybe it was time for a name change, but it's been around. It was set up after the Rio Earth Summit as the place where the private sector would come together to do its part of the sustainability change. So it's got a long and venerable tradition of working with these really ambitious companies. And I was really pleased to join them last year. It's great.
So it actually has an official function within the UN system. It is the official convener of business, the World Council for World Business Council for Sustainable Development.
That's right, and it also is the sort of corporate partner of the Marrakesh Partnership, because you and I have been around you've been around a lot longer than me in this space. You took the early decision to focus on what I came to slightly later in life, but the UN process has always been set up as an intergovernmental convener, and of course right from day one there was this question about what about the private sector, what about the so-called real economy. And WBCSD was set up as the place for that to happen and has this role in the Marrakesh Partnership, which is the sort of action partnership bit of the COP, which of course has also now been assisted by the hiring of the climate action champions, the wonderful Nigel Topping. And actually I made a lot of terrible decisions as a politician, but a very good one was to hire Nigel Topping as the climate action champion for COP26.
Well, that's right. And but now WBCSD, Peter Backer, a name that you threw in there, he's, I believe, is he not ex-McKinsey?
No, he's not. He is ex-TNT. He was the CEO of TNT, yes, the Dutch logistics company. I don't know if he was McKinsey before that.
Because you're ex-McKinsey, I'm ex-McKinsey. With climate is, you've got people, Adair Turner,
yes.
Jeremy Oppenheim. I mean, it's a sort of graveyard of old McKinsey grandees plus me, because I never made it to being a grandee. Isn't that right?
Well, it's really interesting because so WBCSD, of course, has its own staff. But the point of it is to basically bring businesses together to work in a pre-competitive space, as we call it, on a lot of the issues around decarbonisation, sustainability. And really interestingly, WBCSD wrote the greenhouse gas protocol back in the day with WRI. So it was the first organisation to recognise the need to actually have accounting rules, if you like we do for cash for carbon. So we do lots of stuff on our own with our members, but tons of consultants in the space. And we work very closely with McKinsey, also BCG, also Systemic. So yes, the consulting firms are still going strong. And I guess it's because it's the, look at the Davos agenda this year. This has become the #1 topic for businesses. How do you build forward in a sustainable way and continue to make money doing so?
Now, the greenhouse protocol, that is the one that says there's this thing called scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3, is it not?
Yes, that's right. And it's basically, if you're a company, exactly how do you account? And it's being updated. I mean, this is all very, some people think this is very dull when you say, well, actually, we're updating the GHG protocol at the moment because we need to include things like offsets and insets and land use changes, the hot new thing about how do you remove as well as mitigate. And without that, how do we know we're comparing apples to apples? It's super important.
Well, can I make a plea for you? If you are updating the protocol, which I didn't know, can you please scrap scope 3 in any current incarnation? It's utterly absurd because everybody, the idea, I believe, was to double count, triple count, quadruple count scope 3 to make everybody feel guilty, but it's absolutely hopeless for any sort of accounting for carbon.
Well, everyone's scope 3 is someone else's scope 1, right? So this is what's really fascinating. And actually, at the moment, there are just all sorts of bizarre conversations about, when do you account for scope 3? And it's, I agree.
Because our audience are not all specialists. We're going at great speed, as could be expected with you and me, but we need to back up. Scope 1, scope 2, scope 3. Let's do a quick revision. Can you lead on that? So your organization invented the damn thing.
Liebreich Enterprises, scope 1 emissions, all the stuff that you are burning, from your servers, from your driving, from cars that you might have associated with the company. I'm sure you've got a Tesla, Michael. Scope 2 is that plus your energy. Not yet. That plus your energy. Factoring in what is the biggest source of emissions globally. Scope 3 is all the emissions associated with your business going down your supply chain and forward to your customers. And you'll say, well, that's ridiculous because how can I possibly account for, the fact that Claire Perry might be sitting in a home that's powered by coal? How could I, which it isn't, by the way, how could I account for her emissions? So then you get into questions of materiality. How far should you incorporate your scope 3 emissions into your own footprint? And at the moment, it's a bit of a wild west. Companies, the most responsible companies, really want to get involved in decarbonising their own supply chains and also helping customers make better, lower carbon decisions. So it's great that they want to go up and down that ecosystem, but it's a minefield, and that's why we're working really hard to try and put some more guidance.
So to your point about my car, it's a bit of you've hit a bit of a raw nerve there because I'm actually very virtuous, and I've got these sort of super insulated homes. My home in London is the only Victorian 1865 building that's actually got an A certificate, and it's all green utilities. And here in Switzerland, it's all green. But I can't find a 7-seater that can get up and down the hills here in winter in Switzerland on ice, full of luggage. And family, and so I drive a petrol 4.4 litre SUV. I'm not proud of that, although it's a hell of a car. And I will get.
I think it's good that you admit this, Michael. And actually, interestingly, I was having this conversation with my boss, Peter Backer, who is driving a Tesla. Really hard to keep a charge in really cold weather as well.
Yeah.
So this is one of the other questions, things that work well in a sort of, a benign environment struggle. So there are clearly technological things that we still have to adopt. And
my view is I work personally on the things that I can do personally with, let's call it modest cost and modest sacrifice. And then I work like crazy on the systematic change to get the other things fixed, like flights and the right sorts of vehicles. But coming back to scope 3, here's the issue I have. The reason I think it needs to be, scrapped is probably a bit over the top, but a massive revision is that the scope 3 is if you are an airline, then the scope 3 is is that scope 2 or scope 3, the fuel that you burn?
Well, it's an interesting question. Steel's a better example.
I want to do fuel because you've got the airline, you've got Heathrow, you've got the insurance company, right? You've got the airframe manufacturer, the Boeing or the Airbus. You've got the McKinsey whose consultant is on the
Yep.
aeroplane. You've got the catering people. You've got, and they all count the same carbon as scope 3, or they should, because it's very material. It's absolutely core to their business models, to those flights and the carbon emissions associated. And so if you're an investor in all of those, if you're an investor in what's it called? The gates, the people who do the catering and the insurance company and the airline and this and that, then you are going to quintuple count or more those emissions, which makes it impossible to figure out what is the footprint of your investment portfolio.
Of your business.
If you just take scope 3.
Well, exactly. And then, well, and that's why so I think there's an observation, and then there's a incorporation number. So there's sort of, because what you want to see is downward trends in all of those, but there's a question of what can you actually influence in that process. So you're the airline, you can influence your fuel purchases, you can be investing in lower carbon fuels, you can have a conversation with the airline. You can't really change the energy footprint of the McKinsey consultant who's on the flight, let's say. But isn't it good that we're asking these questions? I think what's so fascinating now, if I just throw one thing at you, is this sense of corporate responsibility. I think, and dealing with these tough questions is running much hotter than many governments in terms of how they're taking their approach to carbon accounting. And it's really fascinating. One of the things I've seen, having been in the public space and then now in the sort of private sector space, is, we can talk about COP and the incredible tentpole moment it is, but when you actually get to the how of decarbonisation and these nitty gritty questions, I'm not allowed to say that, and these tough questions, how can you actually, what tools do you need to decarbonise really? And that's one of the things WBCSD does, is sort of answer the how of it, like writing the first GHG protocol.
I think first of all, I think it is absolutely fantastic that we're asking these questions. I guess I'm hearing them a lot from the finance community, where they want just a sort of simple measure that says, okay, this portfolio, is it an okay portfolio or a not okay portfolio, or can I market it even better than that as a, is it net zero? Is it a 2040 net zero, or is it 2050, or is it not? So, and for them, simple accounting, non-accounting without duplication is really, really important, and we've not got that. And it sort of feels to me like we really need to go back to sort of first principles and say, look, what is it? It's the fossil fuels that emit that create the emissions and a few other things. Let's count them and then go downstream until we find the decision maker that could have said, no, I won't have a 4.4 litre petrol SUV. I'll have an electric vehicle, who's chosen the opposite. I think, this idea of responsibility, engineering and around decision science, absolutely. But and then we ought to be using things like distributed ledgers and blockchain to do that.
Exactly. That is so two hugely important points. I mean, one is that, which is that we know in no way are using sort of fungible tech to support this process, and whether it's, by the way, whether it's accounting for scope 3, whether it's accounting for carbon markets, hugely important that we have tools that we can use. And in fact, one of the Pathfinder projects we're working at WBCSD is exactly that, which is an emissions reporting system grouped around the world's leading consumer goods companies with their supply chain, and enablers like SAP and IBM, who are actually designing a distributed ledger, secure, so we can actually start to measure. But Michael, you should come and be part of my advisory team, so we can throw these things up at people like you, and you can say, that's just complete nonsense, I don't understand any of it. So I'm going to approach you about that.
Here live, I can accept the challenge being on your advisory group. I'd be absolutely delighted to, as long as we talk about these exact sorts of things, because I do feel that we tend to accept too much and challenge too little of this architecture. And the fact is, if you look back you look back now, and Kyoto, nobody really talks about Kyoto anymore. And in 20 years' time, maybe nobody will talk about scope 3, but they will talk about the distributed ledger approach, and they will talk about the mechanisms, the infrastructure that we put into place today. and it's important to get it right. It really makes a
And
difference.
actually, you're right. And I missed a second point of importance, which is, for me, this is about forming coalitions of the willing that agree to do the same thing. So if you can get, the world's leading consumer goods companies, the world's biggest utilities to conform, and you can always iterate, you've got a group who work together, then you can start to have some clarity to your investor point. What you need is, and it's the same with it's the same with NDCs. You need circular, an agreement from a coalition of the willing, if you like, to be measured on the same basis. And again, that's something that we do.
Well, let's come back to the NDCs and the pledges, these extraordinary pledges for net zero. But I want to just throw one other thing where hopefully in my new role as advisor, as a member of the
yes, I'm sending you a contract now.
And that is offsets, because I'm an advisor to Equinor, the Norwegian oil company, but I also talk to people in aviation, and I talk to people at various other points, and they're all the ones that are committing to net zero. They're all essentially saying we're going to get a lot more efficient, and then we're going to offset. But they're actually double counting the offsets as well, aren't they?
I'm not sure I agree with that. I mean, I guess the issue for me is, anyone setting a net zero pledge in almost any industry, and indeed any country, is going to have to mitigate the hell out of their emissions and then remove. And whether they're really remove, not just reduce, but it basically sequester, either biologically or in some industrial way. And by the way, we need to adapt, and we never talk enough about adaptation. But with that approach, I think we've spent too much time arguing about offsetting. I mean, this has been a painful debate for many years, both in the NGO and the COP space. And I co-chair the National Natural Climate Solutions Alliance with Justin Adams from the WEF. This sense of, again, how do you create momentum? How do you create accounting rules around this? And how do you actually create nature positive solutions with a ton of money that is flowing? And by the way, doing it with really good guardrails. So you only want companies who are committed to net zero. You only want projects that effectively can nest up to a jurisdictional level. But could we just, bloody well get on with it? Because we've all been debating this question now for years and years. And I think there is incredible opportunity to do high quality natural offsets. And I'm not sure I would agree it's double counting. But I'd love to know your view.
Let me give you I agree that there's this huge opportunity to create those offsets. By the way, it's not going to be nearly big enough to offset all the things that, if you look at all of the, the oil companies that say, and the last bit will offset, and you look at how much room there is to cut off, there isn't enough room. But here's the issue. If British Airways goes net zero, and BP goes net zero, and since we're using that example, McKinsey, who puts the consultant on the plane, says net zero, who has to buy the offset? And how do you make sure that somebody's buying one offset, not zero, but not three? And this is not saying we shouldn't have offsets, not at all. What I want to see, and by the way, it's not only can those three players buy the offset, but what do you do when the UK buys the offset, or Norway, and then gives it or trades it with, I don't know, Gabon or Mali or Brazil or wherever? I mean, how do you keep this stuff straight? Because with no accounting that is robust, the answer is...
that is the point. And I think the question, so first of all, I think I have huge, like any exchange, and no exchange will work unless you have clear guidelines about what can trade. Think about the debt markets, right? So whether it's a sovereign debt or a corporate debt, everything trades. There's a set of rules, there's a set of accounting principles, there's a ledger effectively. And I think you can do that. And the more you can get disclosure, like the sort we've talked about that's imperfect, but including scope 3, the more you can see where these double counts are and strip them out. And ultimately, if you're a project developer and you're accredited, and we know what you're actually sequestering, we know what's happening in terms of the quantum, in terms of the reduction. And that's something we don't have right now. We have lots of claims that are essentially reported by the demand side, but not the supply side. And I guess the thing that I think is urgent, Michael, is, look, you've been in this space a long time. I've only been in it, I've been in it now. It brought me into politics, as we know, but in terms of really getting embedded, it's been a lot less time. But the urgency of this stuff just builds up and up. And I am fed up having arguments about the perfect. I think we need to do everything well now. And again, when I wrote the COP action plan for COP26, you know, when I served as the president designate. We've just got to crack through some of these conundrums. And again, it won't be perfect, but if we do it in a transparent, trustworthy way, it'll be good. And also things like voluntary markets can be great pathfinders for the so-called compliance markets. You know, we don't have to run these two things in separate silos. So I guess I'm just a kind of eco-pragmatist who wants to stop, who wants to talk, who wants to improve, but actually also wants to get on with stuff.
Yeah, no, and eco-pragmatist is exactly how I label myself if I'm in the labeling business. So I agree with that, and I will also declare that I'm doing a bit of work with Guy Turner, who is the former head of carbon and then chief economist for New Energy Finance and then Bloomberg New Energy Finance, because we both started from this position saying we've got to do offsets. We've got to do, by the way, high quality offsets. We've got to make sure that the proceeds gets into the hands of, for instance, you know, African nations that really need to remediate their loss of forestry and their degrading environments, and other countries, Southeast Asia and so on. And we were just watching all of these corporates saying they were going to do offsets. And so what we're doing is a big piece of work that is about measuring supply and demand of offsets in the voluntary markets. So that's very exciting, and I look forward to revealing that, and I'll share it clearly. Will be very relevant, I think. One thing I would say is that my simplifying assumption is that the private sector, the voluntary markets, probably with some regulated, but mainly voluntary, will be really good at reforestation and carbon capture. There's something very simple about it. You polluted, therefore now you go and put this stuff back, and you can sort of see how that works. But I think it'll need to be the nation to nation, it'll be the governmental markets that will have to deal with avoided deforestation, with degradation of environments, because that is so multidimensional, involves so much sort of sociology and anthropology and politics and goodness knows what else, that I can't see the private sector just sort of saying, oh, we're going to just go ahead and tell, I don't know, Guyana not to chop down its rainforest, and that's going to be for 1,000 years. I can't see how private sector can do that.
I think that's an important point. But there are definitely, and this gets back to the kind of jurist, you know, what level can you guarantee an outcome? And I guess you said something really profound, which is unfortunately true, which is most of the flows are flowing into private projects in the Northern Hemisphere. So the Trillion Trees project, really exciting, captured everyone's imagination at Davos last year, you know, some questions about implementation. It's basically planting trees in the US and Portugal. The money is not flowing to the most degraded parts of the world, and frankly the areas where it could be a huge important part of a rural transition that particularly benefits women and girls, which I'm particularly think is important. The question of avoided deforestation is hugely complicated, and my only question is, having been a politician for 12 years, I find it interesting that we are prepared to trust jurisdictions with all of their political ups and downs in order to deliver this long-term outcome. And the complexity of nesting that in a developmental process with additional finance and monitoring, as you say, is, I mean, it's hugely important, but it's also hugely difficult. And I think there are other asset classes. So I'm particularly interested in soil as an asset class, because again, that trails an important economic uplift potentially as well. And also we talk about blue carbon, a lot smaller but important. So I think there are really interesting areas that the voluntary market can get into. I probably agree with you in terms of the big, you know, the big population shifts and structural things that you need to do for avoided deforestation. That is a government to government conversation, but it is fraught with difficulty. You know, I sat through the whole of the Article 6 negotiations in Madrid. It was very painful. Had lots of conversations with Ricardo Salles, my mate, the Brazilian environment minister. You know, politics changes, and then policy changes, and then you're in a totally different place, and there's almost, it is very difficult to deal with that.
Well, so I one of my very early forays into this particular area, sort of offsets and nature-based solutions, I got called an evil ... by the parliamentary, the researcher for a member of parliament in the UK, because
really, Michael.
Well, because I questioned whether you could simply use carbon payments to stop deforestation in the Amazon. And I was, and my thinking was, well, at the time there were 22 million people live in the Amazon. So do you just give them payments to sit under trees, or are they allowed to have things like schools and roads and jobs?
Yeah,
And all those sorts of things?
exactly.
And by raising that question, I was called, I was told that I was trying to slow down and I didn't understand the penguins, the polar bears, the flooding,
No.
etc. I was like, no. I just want a system that works.
And this is so exactly. So if you walk in the shoes of, you know, people in the Amazon, and you walk in the shoes of the Brazilian government, who's made a number of political promises, that is exactly the thinking, which is, what do? We just put a fence around a park as big as the EU and say, off you go, be pastoralists and have some money. And that is the challenge. And also it relates, you know, there are so many conversations that are like this, where you say, if you're South Africa, we really want you to come off coal. I started the Powering Past Coal Alliance. Just switch off coal. It's really, really bad. Okay, let's have a real think about that. Let's think about the politics of who, you know, the president, supported by the coal miners. Let's think about the role the coal mines play in the social fabric and the economic fabric of the country. Let's think about Eskom's financial situation. This is really very tough. And so what you need then is the sort of, I think, and this is a conversation to be had with the IMF and others, you need a sort of Bretton Woods type structure. If you really want to move the world off coal, how do you finance that transition at scale and sensibly? It's not enough just to finger wag and tell everyone to just, you know, stop, only buy renewable energy. So you're right on it. This is and this is what's so important in the climate context, and why I've also learned over the last few years that you have to start with the world as it is and work from there. And you and I will always disagree about the pace of change for renewables, but you know, you can see a lot of the economic stimulus for that change. Some of the other social and political arguments are much more difficult.
Well, I'm not sure we will disagree in this. I mean, I actually don't think so, because I think we're going to furiously agree. But I also want to I want to move us on, because you mentioned Powering Past Coal and how you launched it. What you may be forgetting is I also launched it. I don't know if you remember.
You did. You were there. You were my MC.
I chaired the launch session, and it's one of my proudest memories, because what was fabulous was there was this great room. There was you. There was Catherine McKenna from Canada, the Minister of Environment at the time, and there were all these nations, and it literally went around and it sort of said, UK, and it said Canada, and then it had I think Belgium, and it had various things, and then it had Liebreich, and I had, you know, and on Twitter there were these people joking, and they're saying, oh, I see they gave you your own nation now.
You know, but you also remember that it was like one of those, it's like being at a charity auction, because lots of countries came up and pledged at that time. And this is, I think, often the best thing. So Catherine and I, you know, really enjoy working together. We had the idea of PPCA over a cup of coffee in New York in a climate week. You know, how can we encapsulate the coal transition, the most important thing we can do, and speed it up and create a place of ambition? Because both countries are, you know, and the UK has got this extraordinary track record now of coming off coal. And it's really caught the imagination, and it was a great thing. And thank you so much for launching it. And it was fascinating to see that this countries, and indeed, you know, Germany is now in the process of joining the Secretariat, because the German position on coal has changed so markedly in the last 5 years. So it was a really good thing to do. And I think there's still more we can do to advance that.
Definitely, and you're right. There were countries, because I was trying to chair this session, and I kept on having sort of Sherpas coming up and saying, you know, I'm sorry, I can't remember all of the countries.
Portugal wants to join, or yeah.
The minister demands, you know, 11 minutes to speak, and I was like, well, I'll give him 2. It was tremendous. But
no, it was a fine thing.
Your role in government, because you were Minister of State. You were for energy. No, give me the full title, because I'll forget.
So I was Minister for Climate Change, and it rapidly turned into Minister for Energy and Clean Growth in Theresa May's cabinet. So I attended cabinet in that role.
Right, and that period that you were in cabinet was from sort of, you know, fairly early in 2017 to 2019. Powering Past Coal was one of the things, but you also did the Clean Growth Plan. You did the application for the UK, for Glasgow, to become the seat of COP. You led that. I actually remember you canvassing opinion and saying, do you think we should go for this? And I said, absolutely, we should 100% go for it.
Which was not the view of the government, by the way. So it took a lot of work back at home to say, oh, seriously, we should go for this. So I think it's that was
Now,
Yeah.
I mean, if you look at it, President Biden, first telephone call to a non-North American leader on assuming the presidency, and it's to Boris, to the UK. I don't believe that would have happened had we not been the seat of COP26.
Yeah, I probably would agree. I mean, I'm still waiting for that thank you note from Boris, Michael. Can I just say?
Yes, I mean that's an interesting question. Do you think is it, it's tempting to, you're only drinking tea. I wish you'd drunk a few glasses to try and ask you, whether you're still on his Christmas.
No, absolutely. No. I don't. Politics is one of those weird games. Politics is absolutely brutal, and clearly I was very sad to be sort of ousted. It was in a way understandable, because the boring bit about politics is you have to command your own little division in the political system in order to get stuff done. And as soon as I'd stopped being a minister, as soon as I'd left politics, which was a decision, I was trying to do the COP presidency as a non-politician, it became almost impossible, because simply the COP unit couldn't get enough traction with departments. So it's entirely in Boris's decision. It was not done well. Dominic Cummings' signature was to dump a bucket of manure over everyone's head once, 6 months or a month after they'd fallen out. So I'm jolly glad he's gone. But no, I text Boris and Carrie, and I don't believe in burning bridges ever. And I'm really pleased that this has given the country and the government some fantastic opportunities to do the right thing. And I think by and large, they're seizing them. I've been really impressed with what the government's been pledging to do.
But do you think part of the reason was also Brexit, that, you were a Remainer quite outspokenly, and, the thinking was, of course, before COVID, COP was going to fall just at this critical moment when not only the EU negotiation, one of the many, deadlines, but also the US negotiation was potentially coming to a head. And do you think there was part of it that just said, we're going to have we're going to have a semi-detached minister who's going to be seeing things only through a climate lens, potentially being very rude about President Trump, because that's who it would have been at that time. Was there an element to that, do you think?
I don't think so. I mean, I'd actually reached out to President Trump's chief of staff in Davos last year, because I said, frankly, you misunderstand the Paris Agreement and the opportunity for homegrown green jobs. And what you should be campaigning for is a trade adjustment on carbon. Yes. That would play right into the Trump playbook. So I look, it was just a whole swirling mass of things, and ultimately the government wants to put who they want in the role. Yeah. And I'm really pleased Alok is going to do it full time. I think Kwasi's a great business minister. I think the COP role, it's so. If you're going to do it properly, if you're not just going to sit there for 10 days and wield a gavel, if you're actually going to try and build the consensus and the bridges out of the NDC space into the real economy, as it's quite sweetly called, I think you've got to do it full time. And I wish him well. And I'm working with the various elements of the COP team and doing what I can to help.
Yeah, on President Trump and trying to get his advisors or him to see the light on clean energy related jobs and how this should be such an engine for growth. In 2015, somebody approached me and said, I've got half an hour with the key advisors. I need your help prepping me, because we're going to tell them how many jobs there are in wind and in solar and in this and that. And I just said, you are kidding yourself if you think that in any way they're going to listen. This is all about the semiotics, the signaling, and all of this stuff is just being portrayed as evil. There's nothing we can do to change it. I'm a never Trumper. Count me out. And I'm glad I did, because frankly, it would have been pointless.
A waste of time. And also the tweet about caring more about the citizens of Pittsburgh than Paris. It was like, dude, there's one atmosphere. It's 60 miles thick. We're all dependent on it. Could you just, for a second, use your native intelligence?
The mayor of Pittsburgh has already been extremely clear that he remained here. He was one of the "we are still in."
I love the mayor of Pittsburgh. He's a great guy.
No, and I think there's a whole. We could do a whole separate session or drinking session on why climate and why energy technology has become this kind of tribal marker. But I want to get back to some of the things you said about about COP and some of the things that you did while you were minister there, because there was also the Clean Growth Plan. That was the first industrial strategy really that the UK had since Margaret Thatcher, is it not?
I have a copy of it which I carry around with me, heavily annotated. So basically, when I came in, and Nick Hurd was my predecessor, who's a great guy, and again has got hugely amazing credentials in this space, but it struck me that we were speaking about the UK's ambitions in an apologetic tone. So our position was, we're terribly sorry that we haven't done more. And my view was, holy shit, we've got the Climate Change Committee. I'm one of almost the only ministers in the world with carbon budgets. We're 93 and 97% towards our carbon budgets ending in 5 and 10 years' time. So, we're on track. And this is a massive opportunity to basically try and align all of our economy around this very optimistic narrative that's good for jobs, good for growth, good for finance. So I basically turned it from a sort of slightly hair-shirted thing into a full-throated, this is amazing. And also I was very keen that it wasn't just the usual load of stuff that comes out often in government reports. It was a very clear set of policies and actions and principles that would, including actually, hydrogen, carbon capture and storage, the offshore wind.
Offshore wind, the whole plan, right?
The offshore wind sector deal, to me, one of the, again, and it's super relevant actually for these Mission Possible deals that we're doing. If you can align the public and private players together around the outcome you want and the price you want and the investment you want, you can do extraordinary things. Why? Because you can term out demand signals in a way that the markets love, and which governments find really hard to do. They say, oh, you can't possibly commit us to buying wind in the next parliament. It's like, well, then you're not going to see the price that you should. And it was really, and huge, Ørsted were great in that process. Baroness Young was super good. And we came up with a really good outcome, and particularly around the supply side stuff, right? The big row now is, how are we going to onshore some of this offshore wind production? Yeah. And that was part of the offshore wind sector deal with these minimum targets. And that was a really good thing. And actually, one thing I was super proud of was framing and bringing in the net zero legislation, because again, we were the first industrial country in the world to do that, followed 24 hours later by France, to be fair, but we got there first. And it was done.
Not that we're competitive, right?
Yeah, no, it's because we're a better country. No, I don't believe that. I think we're great. We're all great countries. But it was, and actually the consensus we had, and interestingly, Michael, the political consensus, one of my big things was that we all basically want the same thing. We're just disagreeing about the rate of change, with a few holdouts, some of the individual politicians, including Jeremy Corbyn, who was a great fan of coal mining back in his day, would object to different parts. But essentially, all the political parties wanted the same thing. And we had extraordinary consensus in that period of time. And that's one of the reasons it was easy to get stuff done.
But when you look at it now, you were minister at a very critical moment where there was all this kind of architecture being put into place, not the Climate Change Act, but a lot of the kind of what we see today, the net zero and so on. Were you not worried that it would be dismantled or downgraded? Are you not, or let me flip that around, are you not sort of shocked and pleasantly surprised just how much people are singing from the same song sheet? Because I mean, Kwasi Kwarteng was not a climate warrior. Andrea Leadsom was not a climate warrior. And yet when you listen to them now, this is the song sheet. There doesn't appear to be a different one or a resistor movement anymore. Well, not meaning.
I guess there was a confluence of that with the rise of the protest movements, that this became very, people were having very uncomfortable conversations with their kids. When the IPCC report came out in 2018, it was front page of the
degrees. October 2018, 1.5 degrees.
Yeah, that was on the front page of the Telegraph. So suddenly these questions had gone mainstream, and I very slightly flatter myself that I was able to persuade a big chunk of the government and other political parties that this was something that this was a no regrets thing to actually do.
I also I give Michael Gove a lot of credit, because I think he also thought it through. And
he did.
He is somebody who tries to be internally consistent in his views and logical. It was sort of, so I have seen his influence in this, maybe more than it really was.
He was a great ally. So around the cabinet table, the Treasury would always be reluctant. So we don't want to do the COP. This is so expensive. There was always that institutional resistance from the Treasury. Delighted, by the way, that they're now issuing a sovereign green bond, because it just makes good sense. That was a huge
Yeah.
battle. Michael was always brilliantly consistent. Theresa May was extraordinarily positive about this. And again, huge credit to her for just making this front and centre of basically the Tory offering. And Boris,
Yeah.
has, with Zach around him and his partner, and Boris has definitely got religion on this. And Boris is a pragmatist. He saw, and he was when we were having that conversation about should we have the COP in Glasgow, he was foreign secretary at the time. He was one of the first people I phoned, and I said, this is a brilliant opportunity for post-Brexit Britain, and he just got it completely. So he's behind it too.
And you and I have both worked with him because I was on the board of Transport for London, and he does understand the simple idea and the symbolism of doing it in Glasgow. We're having a discussion about the union. We've got to demonstrate that Scotland is better off as part of the union than separate. And the stage that will be the international influence that will be in Glasgow in November this year is going to be quite extraordinary. So I think he does see these things just very simply.
Absolutely, and I think and I wrote a fairly critical letter when I left the COP team, because for all the opportunity, it was painfully difficult to get the government to engage.
Yeah.
Remember, this is when we thought COP was last year. We had 6,000 hours left, and we didn't have a plan. We didn't have a negotiation strategy. Thank goodness, we're now in a very different place.
I'm so glad that it was postponed, because it just seemed like we're going to go through. It's going to be an enormously painful period, and it still is. But getting everything, having the time to get everything in order, and really kind of do the groundwork, and whoever the president is, having the time to sort of run the diplomatic traps. And now look at this. We're going into COP, and we just calculated, my team today, 76% of the world economy has now made some form of net zero pledge. 76%, if you include obviously the US and China in 2020.
Which you have to, right? So that is the big. So the big things we have to get are the US, thank goodness, China and India to a position of both pledging but also delivering. And this is what's so important. So no, we're in a totally different place. It's really exciting.
I'm very worried. I'll be honest, I am worried about India and Africa and the big developing countries, the Indonesia, Malaysia, Egypt, Iran, Bangladesh, Thailand, Vietnam, very populous countries. And, if you look at why did Kyoto fail, because nobody anticipated the extraordinary surge in Chinese wealth, productivity, but also environmental footprint. And I worry that we're going to do all of this work and declare victory in November this year. And then over the next 15 or 20 years, in some way, or many ways, thankfully, these countries are going to become very wealthy, but they're going to be the next problem, the next set of problems from an environmental perspective.
I think that's absolutely right, Michael. And look, you and I and others who are watching this will know. So Kyoto was extraordinarily difficult because there was an element of mandation. Paris, incredible diplomatic achievement, but very, very light touch in terms of what was required. Show up with your plan. The plans can be somewhat inconsistent, and there's no mandation to do anything other than show up with a new plan every 5 years. And the key challenge, again, is when you visit those countries you mentioned and you say, how are you going to do this? The politicians say, my first pledge is to give the people of my country 24/7 electricity. How can you expect us to suddenly be installing, different grid systems, paying for expensive renewables, of course, renewables dropping? We just need to get on with this development pledge. And that is always the argument, or the conversation I want to have with what can feel like a very Northern European group advocating for much more rapid emissions reduction. I think it's doable. I think it's much more difficult. I, as you know, think there is a role for gas in the transition mix, and particularly clean gas where you can do CCS on it, because I just think that, whether it's moving straight more to renewables or including hydrogen, these are just great ideas that I don't think can be scaled to meet the development needs. And the other thing, and this gets back to your point about sort of some of the poorest countries, a billion people in the world have no access to energy as we'd recognize it. 3 billion are still using primary biomass, wood and dung, for their fuel. Again, I mean, the debates that we have in a highly integrated, developed electricity market are irrelevant for a third of the world's population. And we can't forget that. We have to try and make this a transition that works for everybody.
No, you won't find me disagreeing at all on the those without energy access. I was on the high level group for sustainable energy for all from before its inception. I would disagree on the importance of gas. I'm not absolutist, but I think that what we're seeing, and you mentioned that we might disagree. What we're seeing is such low costs for renewables. That doesn't mean that makes the sun shine at night or the wind blow when there's no, when there's no pressure to blow the wind. But what it does mean is that in many countries, there's already enough fossil generating capacity to balance massive new additions of renewables, because these are countries that are not at the 50% of Germany or the 40% of Texas or the 35-40% of the UK. They've got sort of 6% variable renewables, and then they've got massive amounts relative as a percentage term. And so you could definitely grow. Now, when you get to 60, 70, 80% renewables, you've got to figure out the remaining, how to keep
the remaining thermal load.
And, when you say gas with CCS, I think I agree, except that it's likely to take the form, frankly, of blue hydrogen, because when you build gas with CCS, it's so capital intensive, you won't want to run it just for the sort of 2 or 3 difficult months or the 1 month or the 3 weeks a year. You would want to run it 24/7. So what you'll do is run it 24/7, but then store the hydrogen and use that when there's no wind and no sun. And by the way,
and also use that in your high heat industrial processes. I think that's right.
Well,
I guess I just have
industrial processes are going electric. Sorry, but that's a whole other session. We're going to have to talk about.
Having been energy minister and spent more time than I ever cared to trying to understand the capacity market.
Being lobbied by people who want you to believe that high heat can only be done by gas.
No, I don't believe that. I was going to say more that we still haven't figured out how to spread the system's cost over renewables, at least in the capacity market as we've built it.
Now you're lucky because it's not your job anymore, but you're absolutely spreading the cost. That's an interest. That one we've solved this much technology, and that much how to spread the cost. But I've got 2 things that I want to just touch on, and we've got a few minutes left. One is trade, and the other is some of the sort of social side of things, and particularly gender. But let's deal with trade quickly if we can. I've been appointed advisor to the Board of Trade, and it's a tremendous. I did do quite a bit of work on the environmental goods agreement, which fell apart sadly in 2016. But now all these issues are back on the table: free trade in environmental goods and services, but also something you mentioned, carbon border adjustment. So tell me, what should my position be on the Board of Trade?
Well, this is a fascinating question. I mean, I'm not a trade expert, and this might feel crude, but it seems to me the only way to provide an incentive for exporting developing countries to, truly decarbonize and to accept that this has to be part is to have some form of carbon border adjustment. And that also, back to the Trumpian position, I think helps, socialize what are completely necessary policies in the so-called red wall
follow-up then. Do I get a follow-up question on that, which is, how do you make sure that that isn't just rich country protectionism?
Well, this is true. And also, how do you make it WTO compliant? And I don't know the answers to that, but I think with our new WTO president, who is fabulous, that there's an opportunity for conversation. And what I'd urge you to do in your role, I know the EU's been advocating for some of these positions. I think there's sometimes a knee-jerk reaction in our trade conversations, which is if the EU is suggesting it must be bad. And I would urge you to try and encourage all of your fellow trade envoys to look at the bigger picture and see how this can be implemented.
So my answer so far, and again, it might be crude because I'm not a trade lawyer, is I think we do need, not for most sectors, there's a few sectors where we will need carbon border adjustments, because otherwise we will simply, pith our own industries, lose all the jobs, all the skills,
exactly,
and probably make the same things in a much higher carbon way.
Exactly.
But if we're going to have a carbon border adjustment, then I think I'm going to sort of insist that it's matched to the extent that I can with technology transfer and skills transfer, so that, because in an ideal world, the developing world competes in making low carbon or zero carbon steel and cars and etc. And then we can have a good sort of libertarian ding dong and see who wins, but not a race to the bottom.
And it was interesting to see the Chinese steel company announcements today that, again, you know, I don't think we should just assume that developing world is always going to be high carbon and low tech. I mean, quite the opposite. So I think it's a fascinating question, but it seems to me it's a tool in the armory that we haven't sharpened properly and used. And so good luck with that one, Michael.
And that's something, hopefully, as we go through to COP, I'll refine. And in fact, the Board of Trade is working on a report, and hopefully we'll see some progress on that. The other area, when I talk about the sort of social issues and gender, you came into Parliament and were dubbed by elements of the press a Cameron cutie. And I saw a tremendous spin session after, I'm going to say, the 2017 elections, where you were in the studio late at night with John McDonnell, who was Corbyn's finance. There was the Shadow Chancellor, Shadow Finance Minister, who was so oozing with patronising sort of sexism, frankly, and you absolutely put him back in his place. How, I don't know how to turn this into a question, but what are your thoughts now? You know, you've been through that mill, you've come out the other side. There are gender issues in energy, but there are also gender issues in energy and climate and finance and political sort of executives and
everything really.
What advice would you have?
So I think, so first of all, you know, politics is a horrifically sexist place, and John McDonnell, of course, had famously said that Esther McVey, he'd been at a rally where they'd been calling to, you know, hang her, and it was just horrendous. And it's grim. And honestly speaking, the current government could help itself a lot by finding and promoting some more talented women, because it's basically it looks like a boys' club at the moment. And I was really proud actually to serve under Theresa May and also David Cameron, and have a real effort made to try and balance that. In the world we're in now, you're quite right. So if you look at the industries, the finance industry, the energy industry, super light and on women. And when you find women like Helen McGregor, who's just taken over EDP in France, you know, it starts to get very, no, not EDP, NG, forgive me, not EDP. It starts to get very exciting. But I think
taking over from another woman CEO.
Exactly, only female CEO.
It shouldn't be newsworthy. It shouldn't be newsworthy.
Amazing. Should be. I know. But there's something really interesting in the climate space that I think is fascinating. So there is a sort of climate sisterhood that has built up over the years, and it was something that I was informally saying we should sort of promote at the COP. So you think about, you know, Christiana Figueres, Laurence Chibiana, Patricia Espinosa, Isabella Teixeira. There are these amazing women, so Rachel Hallett, who've been in the space, who've been highly influential and were huge mates of mine, Teresa Ribeiro, in the COP process, and were utterly appalled when I was moved on. I think there's something very powerful there, and I'm actually working with some young women on whether we should recreate a sort of climate sisterhood going forward.
So I had Christiana Figueres on Cleaning Up, and I asked her, I said, look, wasn't the Paris Agreement fundamentally the women's agreement? Because the men had failed for 20 years, and then you've got this, what you call the sisterhood, that took over, and it was all of them, you know, Anne Hidalgo, there's another one that we missed, and so on. And I listed all these women, and then I said, you know, didn't just sort of Laurent Fabius turn up at the last minute as honorary man? And she was absolutely outraged, and she sang Laurent Fabius's praises and said no, but she also made a point that, you know, you shouldn't even be able to list these women. It should be just so obvious, 50-50. I am on the advisory board of the global advisory board of something called the Hawthorne Club, which is for very senior women in energy. What I might do, since you've co-opted me onto your advisory board, I might have to co-opt you to speak to the Hawthorne Club. Mead Harris, who runs it, is just an incredible force of nature. And what they do, very interesting, is they don't work on women's issues in energy. They just work on energy. But other than me, most often there's no other men in the room. You know, if I'm there, then I'm the only guy. But it's such an impressive group. So if you were to look,
and it's just, well, it's a diversity. Yeah, it's a diversity question. And actually interesting to go back to the COP thing. I mean, every COP there is a discussion about gender inequality. And it is true that women and girls are facing down the barrel of climate change disproportionately and can also benefit from climate recovery through creation of economic opportunities. We don't do enough around that. And one of my thoughts with WBCSD is how can I get the global business community to focus on that as an outcome in their climate recovery plans as well. So that might be something else to
And I
work
think it's
on
also
together.
linked, at least in the developed world, it is also linked to women in engineering, because at the end of the day, energy, transport, infrastructure, the adaptation, a lot of these are, construction, energy efficiency, real estate, they are replete with engineers. And so we need to work on that as well, I think.
We've got a lot to do, Michael, in the next few years.
Yeah.
And I know you haven't mentioned it, but I did say one of the funny things was that we did actually, 30 years ago, have a study group going at HBS. And I have kept in touch with, a good handful of people from business school. You're one of them. And, it was, we should have done more with renewable stuff like you did back then.
Well, I have to say that over the last few years, I did cull a few Trump donors from amongst my business school friends that I felt I just could no longer. I don't try to sort of speak only to people who agree with me politically, but there are limits. I have to be up. Claire, it's been a huge pleasure, and we've got a couple of follow-ups, so I know that we're going to be interacting a lot more over the next year than we have over the last few years, where you've been so busy. But thank you so much for joining us here tonight on Cleaning Up.
Thank you, Michael. It's been such a pleasure, and keep up the good work. It's great. Really enjoyed it.
Thanks very much.
Thanks a lot.
Okay.
Thank you.
Take care. Yeah, bye-bye.
Bye.
So that was Claire O'Neill, Managing Director for Climate, Energy and Nature-Based Solutions at WBCSD, and of course, Minister of State for Energy from 2017 to 2019 in the Theresa May government in the UK. My guest next week is another extraordinary leader in the area of climate and sustainability. She's the current chair of the Environment Agency in the UK and a former board member of DEFRA, that's the Department for the Environment, Food and Rural Affairs. Please join me at this time next week for a conversation with Emma Howard-Boyd.